All right, great. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What is up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. We are sitting down with Sterlin Lujan. Thanks for coming on the show, brother.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me, brother.
Much appreciated.
No problem. Glad to be here.
All the way from Texas.
Yep, all the way from Texas indeed, sir.
Yeah, we'll hear a little bit of that accent.
Oh, you're definitely going to get some accent action, for sure.
We got a communications ambassador for Bitcoin.com. Boom.
Yep. That is my current role with Bitcoin.com, and it's been a lot of fun, a lot of traveling, a lot of seeing the world, and a lot of getting people on board with Bitcoin Cash and letting them know the principles of freedom.
Just had to throw in that last bit in there. I like that. Let them know the principles of freedom. Okay, you got to unpack that for us. Can't just sprinkle that on and be like, oh, they're not going to ask me about that one.
Right.
How is cryptocurrency and blockchain, how is that the principles of freedom?
Yeah, this is an interesting discussion because there's a lot of people coming into the cryptocurrency space right now, a lot of capital investment firms and a lot of entrepreneurs, developers, etc., who may not have an understanding of the background of where cryptocurrency comes from. So let's start with step one. Step one is strictly philosophical. So there's this idea of anarchism, which just means without rulers. It means that human relationships should be as consensual as far as humanly possible. And this original idea of anarchism was really developed and teased apart and fleshed out in mainland Europe. And it was strictly more of a leftist and communist-based idea where it was all about the workers' rights and those kind of things. Well, as these ideas got imported into America, a new version of anarchism started to crop up, and it's this idea of individualist anarchism or voluntarism. And the person responsible for really laying down these principles and these ideas, his name's Murray Rothbard. Rothbard was a great academic, wrote a lot of fantastic books. So one of the books that I like talking about a lot that he wrote was called For a New Liberty. For a New Liberty is a book that outlines the idea that voluntarism, or the idea that all human relationships should be consensually or should happen on a consensual basis, is of utmost importance and value. But he also talked about the importance of self-ownership and ownership over our property. And
consensual can be as simplified down to just yes and yes. Both parties saying yes.
That's right. Both parties agreeing to whatever actions or contracts that they engage in, and that's how those relationships should function. But Rothbard's book, For a New Liberty, laid down these principles. And
we could live in an anarchist society if everything was completely consensual.
Right. Well, if people agreed that instead of relying on governments or relying on institutions to compel people to behave in a certain way, in that situation, people would come to contractual arrangements with each other to determine how society should function and how society should run.
This is good behavior incentivization.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it's all about. Essentially, is incentivizing certain kinds of behavior that is based on people simply cooperating and getting along. Governments are antithetical to the ethic of cooperation. So there's never going to be a situation that crops up with government that allows for complete cooperation and individuals being able to work together peaceably, because everything that government does is interjected with the force of a gun, right? With somebody saying you're going to do this via some regulation, law, rule, or dictum, that you have to follow these precepts or else we're going to hurt you, we're going to throw you in a cage, we're going to put you on some kind of probationary measure. It's going to be some type of pain or suffering that they endure. But we can get to that. I really want to dive into how this anarchist philosophy really merged into the digital realm. As you mentioned, talked about Bitcoin and blockchain, how it moved that direction. So Rothbard came up with these ideas, as I mentioned. And then in the early 90s, there were a group of digital desperados who lived in this area, the San Francisco Bay Area and also Silicon Valley, Santa Clara, etc. And they were referred to as the Cypherpunks. So the Cypherpunks had this idea that we should be able to use digital technologies to regain this power of anonymity, of freedom, of privacy, and to use these principles to literally undermine the state or to get outside the scope of the state. Because, and remember, this was in the early 90s. The internet was in its infancy, right? It was just being birthed, and we didn't even know all the possibilities. We didn't know how it would begin to grow and change society as we understand it. So these folks were already ahead of time. They had an idea that governments would try to get more and more involved with people's communication online. Now here's the connecting point between anarchism and the digital world. These cypherpunks, namely Timothy May, who was sort of the ringleader, who was sort of involved deeply in this movement, he came up with an idea known as crypto-anarchism. Essentially, he wrote the first crypto-anarchist manifesto. I know I say manifesto, it sounds like it's going to be like a 20 billion pages of work and it's going to be dense. Nah, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and you can read the whole thing. But the idea is just the way I outlined it. It's about anonymity, using technology for anonymity, for freedom, for privacy, for getting outside the scope of the state in all matters. And there was another cypherpunk who...
Did you just see, because I want to keep playing on where you're going here, did you see the recent video that was circulated about those intelligent classroom management systems in China?
I did not see that.
Just like a computer vision, facial recognition on every single student in the classroom, watching their emotions, classifying their emotions, watching how many times they raise their hand, counting attendance, counting compliance, and so it's kind of you gave that face of the and I want to see, this is kind of the exact opposite of what you're saying. So
I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's pretty brutal.
Yeah. So then on this one side is this massive big brother governmental oversight to ensure compliance and to ensure safety and to ensure high quality of social compliance. And then on this other side of things is the consensual, voluntary anarchism, completely consensual. We can, as humans, figure out how to engage with each other without the need for a massive governmental oversight to ensure that we can do that ourselves. And this seems to be part of the cypherpunk and the crypto-anarchist.
Yeah, so really the ethic, the guiding ethic behind what a cypherpunk is and what a cypherpunk does is this notion that all relationships should be consensual as far as humanly possible. And obviously having a surveillance police state where all of your actions are monitored and surveilled is not in line with consensual activity, unless someone just loves being a slave and they want to go up to their master and say, will you please monitor every action that I want to take as I move through life? Yeah, that would be their own idea, and that would be fair, but most people, I don't think, want to be monitored, followed. They don't want to have all their data intercepted and spied on. So
what happens with bad actors?
So this is a question we get really deep into the weeds of how society can and people can solve problems that we would call disagreements, right? So a bad actor is somebody who most people would disagree with because maybe they want to harm another person. So we'll use just an example of murder, right? So if somebody kills another person, that would be considered a bad actor. And generally, traditionally, in the statist environment, the government would come in and they would send the cops and arrest that person, and they would go through the criminal justice system and then, get effectively thrown into prison. So how these problems have to be solved in a market environment is using, and here's one idea that's been proposed by a lot of anarcho-capitalists, it's using private defense agencies or private security agencies to first make sure that these situations don't arise to begin with, and that's by not being violent and aggressive to start with. Because a lot of times the police force, as it is, and we can see this in the United States, it's very aggressive, preemptive, and actually ends up being the perpetrator of harm over a myriad of people. And to provide an example how a private defense agency would work in real time, like in real life right now, we have examples. So in Detroit, and many people may not know this, but Detroit is a city that has basically lost its governance, right? It's fallen into bankruptcy, and there's not as much of a police presence in Detroit even to this day. So around 15 or 20 years already, a company emerged called Detroit Threat Management. It used to be called Vipers Threat Management. And this is a private defense agency that is charged with the task privately of helping defend the citizenry and defend the businesses. And the awesome thing about this agency is that they boast no loss of life, no casualties. You can't really say that for any American police department. Usually somebody's going to die. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of times we've seen people die when police come out to a situation. It just gets escalated. So these guys focus on human psychology, about de-escalating certain kinds of situations and making sure that instead of actually having a criminal produced, they negate that activity, and they use a lot of psychology to do that. Now, of course, there's still going to be the potential that somebody does harm another person in society that the private defense agency isn't able to take care of defending or creating a situation that arises of that. So what you have to do, I like to use the example of Gaelic Ireland. They had a libertarian community. This Gaelic Ireland lasted for 2,000 years. But effectively, if somebody harmed another person, instead of the society seeing that as a criminal act against the state, instead they saw it as a person who perpetrated an act of harm against another individual. And in the case of murder, of course, the victim isn't there to defend themselves, so the family comes in, and they appeal to these private judges to see about handling that situation, how reparation should be made. And if the person decides to go into that, to go to court, then it would be resolved in that manner with judges called brehons. And this is just an example of a way we could potentially deal with this in the modern age. It wouldn't work out in the same exact way because we don't really have tribal factions like they did in Gaelic Ireland. But that's one method of how to handle it. And if the person, of course, the person who did the bad deed, who murdered the other person or aggressed against somebody, could say, nope, I'm not going to court, I'm not going to deal with this, I didn't do anything wrong. In Gaelic Ireland, that was effectively a sentence of exile. So if they didn't want to deal with the problem, then they were exiled from that society. Now they could stay in society, but it would get bloody at that point because that would basically put a mark on that person that they are just free game for anybody just to kill. So that's not a proper solution I think we would consider valid for the modern era because, first of all, how
You're
good...
saying there's principles across history as well as even today that are implemented, like this private police force in Detroit that's de-escalating situations.
Right.
And there's these different variables that we can potentially push together and different processes that can actually make voluntary anarchism actually something possible.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm gunning at here.
And let's talk about how that looks. It seems to be that it looks a lot like a decentralized and distributed technology, something similar to a blockchain, something similar to a way for people to be held accountable for their actions, but not with massive governmental oversight. So you can't go and kill somebody, but you sure as hell want to be consensual with every single person, with every single action. However this ends up occurring it's very interesting, and I want to see it tested. I want to see it put to practice.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The beautiful thing about this idea of decentralized governance, which effectively will be anarchism, or at least in some jurisdictions be anarchism, is that it's already getting or being prepared to be tested in various places. So there's this really brilliant idea in one jurisdiction called Liberland. Liberland is this basically free country that's in Europe. I forget all of the countries that it borders, but they're in the process. It's a difficult situation because they haven't been able to get it up and running yet because they're having some problems from neighboring governments allowing them to have the free reign jurisdiction or to have it act as a free economic zone where people can experiment with different forms of governance. But the idea that they're planning is that this is going to be a more libertarian society, and it's going to have rules, right? That's one of the concerns people have about anarchism. It's not going to have any rules. Well, I want to clarify also that anarchism literally just means without rulers, without people telling you how to live and using coercion to force that lifestyle upon you. So in Liberland, the idea is that people come in to live, they sign a contract that has the rules laid out, but here's the key: they're voluntary, and we talked about this, is really important. They're voluntarily opting in to engage with people in the society in the ways that are outlined. So if they do wrong, there's going to be some private defense agency or even some kind of private police force that handles those problems. But the beautiful thing is that they agreed to live that way with those people. And this is a real contract. And this is juxtaposed with this idea of a social contract. And that's what we live under currently in modern society. But the problem...
So we have a social contract right now between each other that we're not going to beat each other up.
Right.
What contract?
Right.
Is there because we are still beating people up.
Right. That's a great question. See, this is the thing with the social contract. The truth is, it's not really a contract. Social contract is just a dictate by a government in a principality that says that because you're born here, you have to live under the rules of this jurisdiction, or we're going to come out and harm you. An actual contract implies that you and I, Alan, we sat down and we laid out, maybe some paperwork, and we determined that one of us wants to engage by the rules of this contract. Social contract in this instance isn't a contract, it's a dictate or a mandate that compels somebody to live a certain way. So the idea of a social contract is really a misnomer in this context.
Okay, because there's a top-down hierarchical command for us to not hurt one another, not necessarily you and I agreeing to one another that we wouldn't hurt each other.
Yes, that's a great way to characterize it. So there's some entity or organization or body of men. And just to be clear, I want to define government so any individuals who are watching this have a clear understanding. Government is just a group of men who have a monopoly on the initiation of force over a large territorial region. And that's a more accurate definition of what a government is. And that particular definition was used by Murray Rothbard and a lot of the Austrian economists as they sort of analyzed and tried to tease apart what a state or what a government actually is.
A group of people who have force over an area of land.
Yeah, a monopoly on the initiation of force over a large territorial region. Yeah.
And that's what we're dealing with. And as far as governance is concerned, it's just a simple group of people, just like us, what everybody would do if they were in any position of power and based on their belief structure, what they believe is right and wrong.
Right. Well, individuals have their own idea of right and wrong, of morality, of decency and dignity, but they can't ever or can't always exercise their beliefs in right and wrong if a government is determining the action that they have to take. In that case, they are compelled to live a certain way. And a great example of this is the drug war. For instance, I think that you and I, Alan, we probably agree that the drug war has been a catastrophic failure. And it's been a failure because of this social contract, the idea that you're born in this place, you have to live in this place, and governments tell you that drugs are wrong, and they create a plethora of laws that are practically incomprehensible because they're so long and so full, but they contain information about a ton of these drugs and how awful and nasty they are.
And many of them are consciousness expanding.
Yeah, bingo. Many of them will actually help heal us or help put us in a state of mind that allows us to introspect and to come to terms with who they are. But governments effectively don't want people to be able to do that. They want to crush people's soul. They want to render people helpless and inured, right? So that
but do you think that's the principle that it was built on in 1776?
We didn't have the drugs that we had in 1776, Alan.
Right? Yeah, they had cannabis. Yeah.
It seems to be, though, that back then the idea wasn't to crush the soul of people. It was more so to provide a 10 basic principles,
Right.
and following these would ensure you a good life. Look at our Constitution. What do we write in it? Why is the Bill of Rights important? Why is the way that we expanded across the U.S. important? Did we hurt people along the way? Yes.
Yeah.
Do we now have sea to shining sea? Yes. Is that important for us to be a geopolitical leader today? Yes. Are we one of the last pillars of democracy on the planet? Yes. Europe, our counterparts, isn't as strong of an economy as we are. There's lots of reason why the earth is not owned by Hitler or owned by communist Russia or China. There's a lot of reason why the earth is still the way it is, and it's because the U.S. was able to do what it had done from those principles onward. So I'm also very grateful for those principles and grateful for the governance that we've had up until this point. Now, is decentralization the next step? And could it become something that ends up proliferating across the planet as something that's decentralized, propelling the We Are One, propelling the consensual agreements? We'd love to see that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say, first off, with what you mentioned about this early experiment in the United States with a constitutional republic, I think the founders, and this is clear in their writings, their intention was to actually create an opportunity for people to be free, especially as it concerns religion. The people in Britain were escaping extreme and severe religious persecution where they couldn't practice their religion with any kind of freedom, or they would literally be executed or harmed in some manner. So I think their intentions and their motives were pure in that regard. But what this experiment taught us was that a government cannot be contained. Lord Acton had that really famous quote, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." So when you create a vacuum of power, it tends to expand beyond control, and that's exactly what happened in the United States. If individuals with power can find a way to expand their field of influence, they're going to do that. And it's often been said that we really have this mentality of worshiping the Constitution, of appreciating the Constitution for what it does to protect our rights. But the problem we've noticed with the Constitution is that it can't stop bullets. It can't stop cops from locking people up and throwing them in a cage. What's happened literally is it's become a living document, and a lot of people tout that as a very important component of what a Constitution is. But what actually ends up happening with a living document is judges can interpret it in any way they want to, effectively giving them the power to make a final judgment on what happens to an individual in the court of law, which is an unfortunate side effect of rampant statism that we're experiencing right now. But to your point about this next step, which I think is utterly and extremely important, we are now moving into territory where we have the resources, where we have the value, where we have the technology to begin experimenting with different forms of self-governance, so that we won't have to rely on centralization and centralized power structures to control us and to oversee us and to make sure that society functions. Now we can write the rules into a blockchain, and we can infuse that blockchain with artificial intelligence, with various ways to control itself, to grow, to iterate, to create a structured society that people can voluntarily opt in. And I mentioned Liberland, but this isn't just happening in Liberland. That's one
We
place.
learned about so many examples today at the Blockchain for Social Justice conference. There were so many. They were like, oh, in Amsterdam, we're testing in these cities right now what it's like when, rather than depending on the corporate hierarchy to deliver you food or a tool that you need when you need it, we'll just get you a very quick delivery of the same price from a local business. And then over time, the community will become so much tighter, and the velocity of money will be moving so much faster, and you'll be able to build up that community in a way that will flourish to a better extent. You just basically you cut off the necessity to rely on the Amazon or the Alibaba. And that changes things tremendously. Not saying that we all have to all of a sudden stop ordering from Amazon and only use local business, but when we figure out how to make the local business completely the same, or close to the same price and close to the same speed, I think it's actually really important and as convenient. I think it's really important to figure out how to thrive in the community that you live in, and do things like have a direct communicational channel between other people in your community and then the leadership in that community. That's the way, that seems to be like such a massive way forward. And I'm just really happy that that's like directly relates to how you're describing the civilization 2.0.
Oh yeah, man, I'm so excited that you mentioned that. I'm really stoked about this particular topic and impassioned about it, because I think what's really going on is that we're in some ways returning to a more primitive state of nature. And I don't mean primitive technologically, but I mean primitive in the sense that we're going to be more reliant on our inner networks. You know, what is it? The Dunbar number mentions the number of connections that a human can maintain in a society where those relationships really revolve around bonding, interpersonal communication, connection, compassion, empathy, all those good, beautiful things that make us human, that really make us human. But blockchain technology, the technologies that we're dealing with, are really what's helping to facilitate this return to a more communitarian environment. I mean, listen, the situation with governments right now and any centralized entity is that some individual who lives thousands of miles away from you, who wears a suit and tie to work every day with an American flag, a pin on his lapel, is essentially telling businesses how to run their businesses, how to distribute their goods between society via regulations, business, corporate taxes, those kind of things, but also telling the individual thousands of miles away. Just imagine this, a person that you've never met before, that you've never had interpersonal contact with before, telling you that they know what's best for you and your life. But this technology really inverts that whole process, turns it back around to the individual communities to make their own decisions, because we have the technological acumen now to actually make that happen. We have the adroitness and deftness of hand to allow technology to grow and flourish in a communitarian environment, which actually invites more connections between people, more empathy between people, more concern about others. And that's really what the modern age is all about. That's what this technological revolution is all about. It's about making those connections and being with people. It's part of what human leisure time should be about, and I think what it is about. And I think with some pieces of the Industrial Revolution, some pieces of too much government involvement has caused us to forget that. But now, in a way, we're coming back to this state of nature. And one of my favorite writers and authors talked about this in a different kind of way. Terence Mckenna, who was a great psychedelic pioneer, mentioned this notion of the archaic revival, this return to this state of nature where we were more closely connected to each other. But in Terence's vision, he did mention the importance of technology and the role of bringing us back to this state. But interestingly enough, it's also a step forward into the future, because it's a reminder of our roots, of who we are as human beings and where we're going. It's really a beautiful, poetic sentiment. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I am also extremely happy that you care about this so much. Yeah, and you speak about it with a lot of passion. I love that. I wonder what it's going to be like, the rebirth back into the nature, into the communities, and how we're going to leverage technology in order to help us get there. I wonder how many of the company execs are thinking about this as like an actual, oh God, maybe decentralization and maybe the community figuring out how to rely on each other and build really strong connections between one another. I wonder how many of them are slightly concerned about that, or if it's maybe the natural trajectory of just decentralizing away from their money and back to everybody.
Right. You know, funny thing about that consideration is I can't speak for like the CEO of Walmart or Target or anything, you know, in the retail sector like that, but I can speak for the quasi-decentralized sector. I was recently watching a video with Brian Chesky, who is the CEO of Airbnb. And in this talk, he's a very articulate guy, and he was discussing this notion of humans starting to connect with each other more as people who don't necessarily have knowledge or firsthand experience with one another. And this is part of this reputation economy revolution that we're entering into, and that's what their business is all about in Airbnb. You're actually having to trust another person to share your space with them. If you host a private room on Airbnb, you're bringing people into your vicinity. That doesn't necessarily mean they're within your community directly. They could be travelers from elsewhere. But this is already about not just for the expedited process of having a place to stay, it's also about sharing the experience of that space with another person, and that also facilitates the bonding process that brings us together as humans, and is also in line with this notion of the archaic revival of returning back to this sort of jubilant state of nature that these folks talked about. But that's what these discussions, of course, are already happening in the upper echelons of businesses, especially in the quasi-decentralized sector. Chesky spent a whole discussion talking about that, but I guess he kind of has to, since his business is focused on the way that people interact with each other in the spaces that they call their personal homes, etc. So I can only imagine that this topic is going to start to loom large as more and more decentralized technologies, especially decentralized versions of the ride-sharing services start to crop up, more Airbnbs that are based on algorithms or blockchains that get outside the scope of having those businesses still have centralized headquarters.
What's the difference between having the centralization of the United States currency versus the centralization of Bitcoin.com?
Right, that's actually a good question, and we may take this one a little bit of a different direction, and just talk about cryptocurrency specifically rather than our company is decentralized, but that's another interesting topic. Okay, so the big issue with governments and their partnership with the banks, which forms like a quasi-banking cartel, is that they actually have ultimate control and ultimate power to print as much money and as much currency as possible and put that currency into circulation. Now, anybody who's studied just a tad bit of history and just a tad bit of economics knows that governments cannot be trusted, central banks cannot be trusted to handle this amount of power, this ability to print as much money as they want to. We can look all over the world for examples in the problems with inflation. For anybody who doesn't know or hasn't studied economics, inflation is just the idea of printing out money, and then once you print out that money, if you print out a whole bunch of it, it devalues the purchasing power of that money and causes the price of goods and services in a jurisdiction to rise. You print too much money and it effectively devalues the money so much that all it's good for is kindling by the bedside fire of the family. And this has happened in places like Venezuela. It's happened in places to some degree in Ecuador, a lot of places in South America, sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of places have devalued their currency to such an extreme amount that it's absolutely useless. So this is effectively the problem with centralization. When you centralize any kind of institution, especially in finance, and you have to rely on these small group of individuals and effectively trust them, what happens is you take a risk of them not making the right decisions and actually harming society and yourself personally in the process. Now, with a decentralized technology or a decentralized route or a decentralized company, instead of having the control centralized in a group of individuals, instead it's distributed or dispersed among a whole vast swath of the population. With cryptocurrency, it's actually distributed globally, with some caveat that there has been a little bit more centralization as a result of the mining process with cryptocurrency. But the beautiful thing about this decentralization process is that it's based on a protocol and an algorithm that determines how much currency, this is specifically the currency example, how much of it can actually be printed out or created over time. So in the case of Bitcoin, 21 million units is the precise amount that will ever be created, and that's what we call the cap limit. And by the year 2140, all of the Bitcoins will be put into circulation. And this is determined by the rules of this network decentralized system. But
it sounds like we're back to, it just sounds like we're back to square one. If there's only it's all about who gets all those 21 million Bitcoins.
Right. Well, I'll definitely address that, but I just want to say that when you rely on a centralized group of individuals to print out as much of the currency as they want to, then you're going to have problems. There's going to be social turmoil as a result of inflation. Nobody's going to be able to connect with each other. Now, the problem that you pointed out with cryptocurrency and Bitcoin is definitely a valid concern. When all of it's printed out, now you have all this, a ton of cryptocurrency in existence. One of the really sweet things about cryptocurrency that's really clever is that even if people start to hoard it, that's what I understand you're coming from, there's going to be this problem of maybe some really greedy people hoarding all the cryptocurrency and holding it. Totally legitimate problem. Cryptocurrency solves that because it's divisible to the millionth decimal point, right? You can break down cryptocurrency as many times as almost as many times as you want. And when you do that, it heightens the value of the smaller fractional units of cryptocurrency. So even though someone's holding a bunch of it, your lesser pieces become more valuable as a result of that scarcity that's been created. So it mitigates that nasty effect that some people may be more greedy and malicious as a result, and that is impossible with centralized fiat currency controls like the Federal Reserve System, because you can't break down a dollar. You can only break down a dollar into quarters, dimes, and pennies, right? You can't.
Did you
break
just
it
say
down.
fiat currency?
I did say fiat.
I was just talking about that at the bar and explained I don't know what that is.
Sure. So fiat currency it literally means by decree, right? It's writ by decree that this is legal tender. That's why it's called fiat, because governments decree it and suggest that people have to use it in society on threat of violence against them, the stuff we were talking about earlier with government. Cryptocurrency wouldn't be fiat currency because it's not by decree, it's being created by a group of miners that people can voluntarily choose to use or not. Hence why there's now competing cryptocurrencies, a myriad of cryptocurrencies that everybody can get involved in and use. So fiat currency literally means by decree, by force, etc.
There's still something that doesn't fully check out about the limited amount of tokens that go out. Because even though that becomes a deflationary currency rather than an inflationary currency, that even then, once you get to the divisible amount of 1,000 or 1 million per Bitcoin, even then there's just something that doesn't check out about someone or a bunch of people. Kind of reminds me actually of the 51% problem as well in mining and just changing the direction of the blockchain. So just something about it still doesn't fully click for me. There's something about these units of exchange. I guess for a temporary solution, it makes sense, but there's an upgraded version that we still haven't thought of. And I'm really interested in what that upgraded version is.
Right, sure.
So I don't even know how long it'll be around then in that case.
Right. So you're concerned.
Your laugh was like, it's going to be around.
Right. I think a lot of, there's a lot of cryptocurrencies now, right? Easily over 1,000. You can go to CoinMarketCap and see just a ton of them. Most of them are just ICO scam coins and shit coins that are definitely not going to be around because their intent is as a pump and dump scheme. But to your point, I guess your main concern is that the cryptocurrencies are still going to somehow become centralized or taken over by
They are centralized.
Group of individuals.
They are. I mean, there's just no way around that. You can't right now explain to anybody that Ethereum or Bitcoin or Litecoin or any of these other coins are completely decentralized, because they're not. Sure. There's a group of developers that still manages the blockchain that the coins run on.
Right. Well, I'm not disagreeing with you. That's true, but it's only true for some cryptocurrencies, or more true for some cryptocurrencies and not as true for other ones. So here's the big issue with that. It's really a lot of people in our industry, in this ecosystem, currently tout the importance of decentralization. And definitely the more decentralization we have, the better. But that's not actually the feature or the quality that we really, really care about. What we really care about is this notion of having a currency that's censorship resistant, meaning that I can send it from me to you in a peer-to-peer fashion. Nobody can seize that transaction, freeze that transaction, stop that transaction. And if we're engaging in that kind of transaction where the message can't be held and stopped, then we're dealing with a situation where we have enough decentralization to validate the mild amount of centralization that has cropped up. So in the grand scheme of things, having a tad bit of centralization is not a problem. Now, let's talk about that a bit more. Let's dive into the situation with mining centralization and look at the problems there. I do agree that mining centralization is a problem that needs to be looked at and examined, but I do think the problem is also overstated a bit. There's problems with a 51% attack. Don't get me wrong, if there are certain coins that have really weak hash rate that are going to be more affected by 51% attack, or an attacker may feel like it's okay to go ahead and attack this coin because it's still young and I have more to gain from conducting an attack. On networks like Bitcoin or even Bitcoin Cash or Ethereum, these kind of 51% attacks, even if they're able to conduct them, just assuming there's a group of miners who controls 51% of the network, you have to ask the question, is that profitable for them to make that attack? Are they going to be incentivized to conduct that attack? In most cases, they're actually not, because if they run the risk of attacking that network, doing a 51% attack and then doing some double spins or defrauding the network in some way, if by accident they destroy that network, well, they've lost all their profitability as a miner, right? They're making an extreme buku amount of money simply from conducting the proof of work activity that's necessary to validate the network. And if they compromise that by trying to cheat the network, well, they may have compromised their own income. So you have to ask the question, is it profitable for an organization, even if they have 51% of the network, to undermine it? Now, yes, there's a lot of guesswork and there's a lot of variables that get involved in this, but recently we had a 51% attack on the Zencash network, and there was another network that had an attack. But because of the young nature and the price for mining those particular coins, it was clearly more profitable for attacks to be conducted on those networks. But one of the cool things about it is, even though those networks were attacked, it wasn't like a permanent attack that just completely destroyed the network. The developers just had to figure out a way to strengthen their network and make it work where there won't be any 51% attacks, because if they don't, well, then that cryptocurrency is going to die and go out of fashion. Zencash, to my knowledge, is still running, still going strong. So
there's this, you can agree to have a small amount of centralization in favor of a vast amount of decentralization. I want to be able to engage with you without a third party, consensually, and that is worth a small amount of centralization for now, until we figure out what's better than this. And I'm so in love with the transition right now. It's great, but I'm still very in love with the genius of what it will be with complete decentralization. And I'm just always trying to figure out what it will be in that sense, for everything across financial transactions, across voting, across ownership, across biometrics, everything. And then there's what happens after money? What's post-money? Because then what's post-money is...
It's still money. It's still value. It's still economy. Post-money, this is it's a great question now, but it's still money.
Right. Yeah, and let's get into that. I wanted to address something that you mentioned first that I think is very important, because I agree with you that we will probably move beyond doing the proof of work. I think a lot of cryptocurrencies are starting to mix a variety of consensus mechanisms. and a variety of ways to validate and verify the network, maintain the network, without just using strictly proof of work. Because there's some other problems with that. Besides the problem of mining becoming an arms race, there's also an issue of power consumption that's going to eventually be a concern. Granted, a lot of people have that criticism, but honestly, the Visa and MasterCard networks consume probably quadruple the amount of energy. And we've written about this on news.bitcoin.com. Anybody can go check it out. But those networks, the legacy financial system, consumes way more energy than the Bitcoin cryptocurrency networks all combined. With that said, I think we're going to move into a
Legacy financial consumes more than all of the cryptocurrencies?
Easily. Imagine all the money that's being produced, all the trees that have to be cut down, all the office buildings that are running the networks, all the middlemen who are using electricity and power. And that's globally. These mining networks they don't have a global presence yet. And if they do exist, they're actually running a lot more, I'll say cleanly, because say they exist in Iceland. A lot of mining operations are in Iceland because they simply plug their miner into a volcano and gain essentially geothermal energy to power that operation. And you can't even give away geothermal energy. There's so much of it. So that's one way to start looking at that solution. But to really dig into the weeds of the future here, what I really love about this is we're going to start seeing blockchains crop up that use a mixture of proof of work and that use proof of stake or delegated proof of stake. These are just a few options that we have on the plate right now. But these mechanisms, first of all, they don't require the arms race of mining. There are still some miners, but they rely on more on-chain governance models, more democratized ways of working on-chain to figure out how to scale, how to grow a blockchain, and also how to make sure that different people have access to different forms of value. Now, just for anybody who doesn't know, proof of stake means that you help verify and maintain the network by holding a stake of those tokens. The more tokens you have, the more work that you can do to verify the network and the more money that you can make. Just as an example, Ethereum is looking at moving on to having also be proof of stake along with proof of work. And this is what's been called the Casper protocol built into Ethereum. Another option is delegated proof of stake, which I really enjoy. It's this idea that a person has stake on the platform and then they can effectively point to another actor in that ecosystem and delegate blockchain rewards, basically the cryptocurrency that's produced by that blockchain, to another person. In practice, this works like this. So there's a platform called Steemit, the Steam blogging platform where people write blogs, and then it's like Reddit.
Ooh, that's our 15-minute timer.
Right.
You want to pass me the hourglass onto your left? It's on the table.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. Here we go.
I will conclude this point. So Steemit essentially works like Reddit. You upvote content, and then on Reddit, though, your post can catch fire and more people upvote it, and it has more visibility. On Steemit, a person who upvotes, if they have stake in the Steemit platform, they delegate the blockchain reward to that post. So it's a way of being able to reward content creators as a person who has stake in a platform. So you basically have influence on that platform with the money you have. But the problem with just proof of stake is that you can get filthy rich by just holding a bunch of coins. And a lot of people have created scams by just having proof of stake-based coins where they can just have the first amount of coins that are printed, and then they can run a pump and dump scheme by hyping up that coin. Yep. And they've got all the money, and they just get more the more people get in. So it really is a pyramid type of scheme, and then they can just dump it all. And that's happened a multitude of times in the ecosystem.
So the future is currently lots of decentralization, little bit of centralization. Okay, and then past that, we'll see what happens. Like you gave a bunch of good examples of kind of what's going on. What's post-money? Let's do quick power round. Power round, because we got a bunch of questions we want to get to. So power round.
So I think this is an interesting. First, let's talk about what is money, right? I think before we can talk about post-money, let's talk about what money is real quick. Andreas Antonopoulos, I like his definition or idea of what money is, and really, money is value. So the problem with value is that it's subjective. We each have sort of a subjective mindset as to what constitutes value, and because of that, really, money's just a collective hallucination. We just all imagine it to have value. So money is just our ability to transfer and to communicate value to each other. So I like to think of money as a form of communication, and if we think of money like that, it's not really possible to go into a post-money society. In some form or fashion, we're going to be communicating value to one another. And if you really think about it, blockchain is kind of post-money, because you're not dealing, the idea of having a token or a coin is misleading.
What if we disassociate ourselves from the conversation of value? What if when we think about producing something, it doesn't actually preclude anyone else from producing it? So therefore, when you say you want to produce a certain part of some sort of spaceship that you want, it doesn't preclude anybody else from doing it, and there's no monetary association to the value of that thing. Therefore, you're just producing something.
Right.
So then there's no association of value to it.
Sure. I think I get where you're headed with this. I think in that type of situation, a lot of people, when they do work, they need to be incentivized for that work, right? If you're producing something, the hope is that you get compensated for that work somehow or another. That's really how human behavior functions. We have to feel that we have incentives to be able to create, to work, to live. All of that stuff is very important. However, to your point, I believe as we look into the future, if we do get into something that resembles this notion of being post-money, it's going to have to do with the emergence of artificial intelligence and the provision of more leisure time for humanity. If we have a situation where we don't actively have to produce as much, and we can accumulate value outside the scope of our own conscious via machines and machine learning, machine technologies, that's a way we can get outside the scope of value, because it's being created for us. And we're already entering into a modern situation where machines are beginning to take certain kinds of laborious jobs over, and that's creating the leisure time for humankind to interact with each other, to get back to this idea of having connections and bonding and being involved in the scope of the Dunbar number. Might create a situation where we detach ourselves from value, but the issue is that it'll continue to crop up if people do any kind of work, unless it's their absolute passion. And not everybody, let's be frank, is going to get to follow their dreams and their passions. It's my hope that eventually we get to that point, but some people frankly don't really have a consideration of what their passions are. Anyway, maybe that's a societal problem, maybe a personal problem, psychological, who knows. But the issue is that when people work, when they conduct some type of labor, even if it is their passion, they hope that they get some type of value in return. But maybe that value doesn't necessarily have to be money. Maybe it can be some other good, some other kind of commodity. But getting outside the realm of value,
it's just a slightly different view here on the kind of the same issue. I think I'm just like a slightly further ahead in the clock of when artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, everything's going on. There's just too much ability to just manipulate matter to whatever degree we want. Doesn't preclude other people from doing it. No cost associated with it anymore. At that point, then I don't think there is something as money. I think at that point, then it's just do whatever you want with your time. Let your digital consciousness go do whatever the fuck it wants as well. And we'll see what the hell that looks like. I don't know anything. I'm just talking on my ass.
And I want you to elaborate with me on that later.
Okay, we will.
If you think you're ahead of your time on a specific understanding of value, what we're each worth. Artificial intelligence may, without a doubt, do all these crazy things that we valued the individual to have at one point, and may do it better, write a better song, write a better poem, build a better bridge and whatnot. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Right. So just to move into the next point, maximizing human potential, something we talk about a lot on the show. There seems to be a growing gap in inequality that's going on. The rich are getting much richer, exacerbated by exponential technology. The poor are just slightly getting more wealthy. So what do you think is going on with that gap? And how does it also relate to globalization? How can we work together across the borders of the earth to propel us all forward together?
Sure. I won't dive into all the philosophical or my personal philosophical views on wealth inequality. I don't think there's any kind of moral issue with just wealth inequality. I think there are some social issues that can potentially crop up, especially along the lines of psychological problems like envy. But what matters is how you gained access to that money. That's a problem. But notwithstanding that, I do think that we're going to enter into a situation where wealth inequality is going to begin to close. That gap's going to begin to close anyway, primarily as a result of the emerging cryptocurrency markets. And I think my personal story is the best testament to this. So prior to getting into the cryptocurrency space, I was just a poor, starving college student, who has student loans and barely surviving. But then I found this little platform called Steemit, which we talked about, and I started writing and typing on Steemit, creating my own value in a digital universe that's outside the scope of the financial system. That right there allowed me to take control of my financial destiny and start trying to at least make myself happier and eventually close my own personal gap in that regard. So that's been extremely important, and I think that the continual growth of blockchain technology, especially the killer app of currency, will help more impoverished people, more people who are struggling, gain some footing. And here's the key thing. We talked about the problem with the financial system, and I think it's the primary issue with why there's such a large wealth gap, why there's wealth inequality. It's because people who play the game of the financial cartel and who's involved in that system, they have more accessibility to gaining a tremendous amount of wealth. And a lot of times it has to do with this idea of cronyism, where these big businesses are working together with
megalomaniacs. Yeah. So, okay, how about we ask you, what is the most beautiful thing in the world?
I think the most beautiful thing in the world are human connections. I think the power of empathy and love and to solve the differences that we have is one of the most beautiful things to me. It's one of the reasons that for one, it's the reason I married my wife. We had such a very strong connection. She's absolutely beautiful inside and outside, and because we had that connection, we were able to work together and to cooperate to move forward into the future. And I think anybody who has engaged in a strong, meaningful relationship where you get to know somebody's soul, where you get to know them on a fundamental, deep, and poetic level, is the crux of human experience. And I can't think of anything more beautiful. It reminds me of that William Blake poem. You're familiar with William Blake, the English poet, who said, "To see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hands and eternity in an hour." To me, that's what relationships are all about, having that deep, entrenched experience of appreciation, mutual respect, and love with another human being.
Mm-hmm. And that extrapolated even past just one person to as many people as we can, and building enough of a community to make one pale blue dot actually prosper collectively without suffering, hopefully.
Absolutely, and I think it's the icing on the cake of everything we've been talking about, this moving back to this more primitive state of human connectedness where we're not as isolated and we're not suffering from consensus trance and we're not failing at our bonding and our connections with each other.
Consensus trance. That's funny. I think I've previously heard that as zombies, or like the being trapped in the hedonic treadmill, these different types of things. Consensus traps. Or as Alberto Grace says, snapping out of the pro-aging trance is something that he says a lot. Next question. Do you think we're alone in the cosmos?
That's a tough one. I haven't thought about that particular question a lot, but my inclination is to say no, we're not alone in the cosmos. I can't say that another life form in the cosmos would be a carbon-based life form. Maybe there's, in my own psychedelic experiences into those realms have told me that if there's beings, maybe there's beings of light. And of course, this is all speculation. This isn't me saying without a doubt that these beings exist, but something tells me that there's some type of other force in the universe that could be considered life. Can't say that it's carbon-based, maybe so. Maybe it's some type of microorganism that exists elsewhere, but I don't know. That's a question that I speculate and think about sometimes, but haven't really delved into. But that's my knee-jerk gut reaction.
Do you think we're in a simulation?
You would, of course, have to ask that question. My problem with the simulation theory, which some scientists and theorists, futurists have also called it brain in the vat. Yeah, right. The feedback loop, huh? I can't say that we're necessarily in a simulation. One of the problems with being in a simulation is it sort of becomes a reductio ad absurdum, right? Well, if we're in a simulation, what about the simulation that created us, or what created us? What if that's in a simulation, and then that's in a simulation, and that's in a simulation? Where does it potentially end, or how can you find some kind of logical resolution?
Sure.
To
Let's
that?
say then by saying, do you think there's a designer?
I'm an atheist at heart. I don't believe that there is a God, but a designer is sort of a different, more nuanced question than is there a God. I think that could be a possibility, but I don't put my cards on that table very often. That's not something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I think that's in the realm of metaphysics. Is there a designer? Possibly. I don't think I have enough evidence and knowledge to give a definitive yes or no to that. But possibility, absolutely.
Sterlin, what a freaking blast. Super fun.
Alan, thank you so much. Yeah, this was a real blast, a real pleasure, treat.
Really appreciate you coming onto the show. Excited to keep in touch, continue building the future together, networking our connections.
Please.
Continue pushing the good word of voluntary anarchism to our world. It's a very fascinating concept that many people don't even have the time to consider and think about what it would be like to just be consensual with each other and not have to look at the top-down force of what we see now with these intelligent school management systems that are going on in China. Exact opposite. Also propelling the good word of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, getting us there, starting in these communities, going really fast. Maybe we can get these fast community connections rolling and build up from the community and cut off that necessity of the top-down hierarchical pull. Really good conversation. Super interesting. I'm really excited to continue our future relationship. So thank you for coming on to the show.
Absolutely.
Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. Yeah, great, enlightening discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. If you guys had a good time, make sure to give us a comment below with your thoughts. Like the video, share it with other people, subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure to create, don't just consume this content. So go and make a video with it, go write a blog about it, just go talk to 2 people about it, have them go talk to 2 people, and all of a sudden we'll start a nice avalanche movement. Also join us on Patreon to continue sustaining the studio, going to cool conferences, networking with cool people, paying the team, because the team really needs to get paid. You heard me right, the team needs to get paid. I'm talking about Ron and Alfredo and all these guys. They need to get paid as soon as possible. I'll keep my pay at nothing, because the less the CEO gets paid, the better the company does. So much love to you guys. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Alfredo, for being here today. Much love. Peace.